The grand ballroom of Eldermore Palace sparkled under the light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. King Christopher stood near the marble staircase, his weathered hands gripping the golden banister as he watched his daughter-in-law Catherine descend the steps. Her emerald gown flowed like water, each step measured and graceful, yet he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. The annual Harvest Festival Ball had been a tradition in the Kingdom of Valdris for over 3 centuries. Nobles from across the realm gathered to honor the season's bounty, to dance, to feast, and to strengthen the bonds that held their society together. But Christopher knew that beneath the glittering surface, something was terribly wrong. He had been king for 27 years, long enough to read the subtle signs of court intrigue. The way certain guests avoided eye contact, the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached, the careful distance his son Prince William maintained from his wife Catherine throughout the evening. Most telling of all was the presence of Cordelia, his second wife, who stood across the room like a storm cloud waiting to break. Catherine reached the bottom of the stairs and curtsied gracefully before her father-in-law. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady, but Christopher caught the slight tremor underneath. "My dear Catherine," he replied, taking her gloved hand and kissing it gently. "You look radiant tonight, though I sense you carry a heavy heart." She looked up at him with those clear blue eyes that had captured his son's heart 15 years ago. "Nothing that concerns your Majesty," she said diplomatically. But Christopher had not ruled a kingdom for nearly 3 decades without learning to see through palace politeness. "Walk with me," he said, offering his arm. They moved through the crowd, acknowledging bows and curtsies with practiced ease. Christopher nodded to the Duke of Westmere, smiled at Lady Pemberton, and exchanged pleasantries with the ambassador from the Northern Territories. All the while, he was acutely aware of his son William standing near the great fireplace, deep in conversation with Lord Chancellor Hamilton. William had inherited his mother's golden hair and his father's strong jaw, but tonight his face was drawn with worry. At 38, the Crown Prince had proven himself capable in matters of state, yet Christopher sensed his son was struggling with something far more personal than affairs of governance. "Tell me what troubles you, child," Christopher said quietly as they paused near a tall window overlooking the palace gardens. The autumn moon cast silver light across the manicured lawns and ancient oak trees. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, watching couples dance the traditional Valdrian waltz in the center of the ballroom. "Sometimes," she said finally, "I wonder if love is enough to overcome all obstacles, Your Majesty." Christopher studied her profile, noting the way she unconsciously touched the sapphire necklace at her throat, a wedding gift from William. "Love is the foundation," he said carefully, "but it must be built upon with trust, respect, and understanding." "What obstacles do you speak of?" Before Catherine could answer, a familiar voice cut through the ambient noise of the ball. "Christopher, darling, there you are." Both the king and Catherine turned to see Cordelia approaching, her burgundy silk gown emphasizing her still elegant figure despite her 53 years. Cordelia had been Christopher's wife for 7 years now, since 2 years after the death of his beloved first wife, Queen Isabella. The marriage had been one of political necessity rather than love, uniting Valdris with the neighboring kingdom of Astoria, but Cordelia had never quite accepted that she would always live in Isabella's shadow. "Cordelia," Christopher acknowledged with a polite nod. "I trust you're enjoying the festivities." "Oh, immensely," Cordelia replied, but her green eyes were fixed on Catherine with barely concealed hostility. "Though I couldn't help but notice our dear crown princess seems rather subdued tonight. I do hope everything is well with the royal family." Catherine's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on Christopher's arm. "Everything is perfectly fine, Your Majesty," she said to Cordelia, using the formal address that emphasized the distance between them. Cordelia's smile was sharp as a blade. "How wonderful to hear. I was concerned when I noticed Prince William seemed so distracted lately. So many private meetings, so many hushed conversations. One might wonder what could be troubling our future king." Christopher felt Catherine stiffen beside him. Whatever was happening in his family, Cordelia clearly knew more about it than she was letting on. The Queen's words carried the subtle poison of someone who enjoyed watching others squirm. "Perhaps," Christopher said with the authority of a man accustomed to ending conversations, "you might check on our guests from the eastern provinces. I believe Lady Margrave was hoping to speak with you about the new trade agreements." It was a dismissal, politely phrased but unmistakable. Cordelia's eyes flashed with annoyance, but She curtsied gracefully. "Of course, Your Majesty." "Catherine, do try to enjoy yourself tonight. These celebrations can be so fleeting." As Cordelia glided away, Christopher turned back to Catherine. What did she mean about William's private meetings? Catherine was silent for several heartbeats, her gaze following Cordelia's retreating figure. "I think," she said slowly, "that your wife knows more about my husband's affairs than I do." The word affairs hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Christopher felt a cold dread settling in his chest. His son had always been dutiful, responsible, devoted to both his family and his future crown. The idea that William might be involved in something that could threaten the stability of both his marriage and the kingdom was almost unthinkable. "Catherine," he said gently, "I need you to tell me everything." She looked around the ballroom, at the laughing nobles, the swirling dancers, the servants moving gracefully between the guests with trays of champagne and delicate canapes. This was her world, had been her world for 15 years since she married the crown prince in a ceremony that had been called the wedding of the century. Yet tonight, she felt like a stranger in her own life. 3 weeks ago, she began quietly. "I returned early from a visit to the children's hospital in the capital. I wanted to surprise William with dinner, just the two of us. It had been so long since we'd had time alone together." Her voice caught slightly. "When I reached his private study, I heard voices inside. William was speaking with someone, and they were discussing arrangements." Christopher waited, sensing there was more. "At first, I thought it might be state business. You know how dedicated William is to his duties. But then, I heard him say something about when the time is right and making sure Catherine is protected. The other person, I couldn't identify the voice through the door, suggested that it would be better if I didn't know the details." "Did you confront him?" Catherine shook her head. "I stood there for several minutes, listening to them discuss my future as if I were a child who couldn't handle the truth. When they started moving toward the door, I slipped away. I've been waiting for William to tell me whatever it is he's planning, but he hasn't said a word." Christopher's mind raced through possibilities. As king, he was privy to many state secrets, but he couldn't think of anything that would require keeping Catherine in the dark. She had proven herself trustworthy and capable over the years, often serving as an unofficial advisor to both Christopher and William on matters of social policy. "Have you noticed anything else unusual?" he asked. "Cordelia has been different, more confident, as if she knows something I don't. She's made several comments about the changing nature of royal responsibilities and how some people are better suited to public life than others." Catherine's voice grew bitter. "And William has been distant. Not unkind, never unkind, but absent. Even when he's in the same room, it feels like his thoughts are somewhere else entirely." A burst of laughter from nearby drew their attention. A group of young nobles were regaling each other with hunting stories, their faces flushed with wine and merriment. Christopher envied them their simple pleasures, their freedom from the weight of crowns, and the burden of secrets. "There's something else," Catherine continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yesterday, I overheard 2 of the senior advisors talking about succession plans and the necessity of difficult decisions. When they saw me, they stopped talking immediately and bowed as if nothing had happened." Christopher felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to form, though the picture they created filled him with dread. In the complex world of royal politics, there were only a few reasons why succession plans would be discussed in whispers, why a crown prince would keep secrets from his wife, why a queen might grow suddenly confident about her position. "Catherine," he said carefully, "has William given you any indication that he's unhappy with the marriage, with his role as crown prince?" She was quiet for so long that Christopher wondered if she'd heard the question. Finally, she spoke, her words carefully chosen. "William loves his duty more than anything else in the world. More than me, more than our happiness, more than his own desires. If he believed that sacrificing our marriage would serve the kingdom, he would do it without hesitation." The truth of her words hit Christopher like a physical blow. He had raised William to put duty first, to understand that being born to the throne meant accepting responsibilities that ordinary people never faced. But hearing Catherine speak so calmly about the possibility of her husband casting her aside for reasons of state made him question everything he had taught his son. "And you," he asked, "what would you do if faced with such a choice?" Catherine turned to look at him directly, and in her eyes Christopher saw not the desperate fear he might have expected, but a quiet dignity that reminded him powerfully of his first wife. "I would fight," she said simply. "Not because I can't imagine life without the crown, but Because I won't let William destroy himself by choosing duty over love. He thinks he can compartmentalize his heart, but I've seen what that kind of sacrifice does to a person. It would hollow him out, leave him nothing but an empty shell wearing a crown. Before Christopher could respond, the music in the ballroom stopped abruptly. All conversation ceased as Prince William stepped onto the small platform where the orchestra had been playing. He looked every inch the future king in his midnight blue formal uniform, the Order of the Golden Lion gleaming on his chest, but Christopher could see the tension in his son's posture. "Ladies and gentlemen," William began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate another successful harvest season. The Kingdom of Valdres has been blessed with abundance, and it is through your dedication and service that our realm continues to prosper." The expected polite applause followed, but Christopher noticed that many of the guests seemed unusually attentive, as if they were waiting for something more than ceremonial pleasantries. "As we look toward the future," William continued, "there are certain changes that must be addressed for the good of the kingdom. Some decisions, while difficult, are necessary to ensure the continued stability and prosperity of Valdres." Catherine's hand gripped Christopher's arm tightly. Around the ballroom, Christopher could see the carefully neutral expressions of the nobles, the kind of diplomatic faces people wore when they knew something momentous was about to happen, but weren't sure how they should react. William's eyes found his father in the crowd, held his gaze for a moment, then moved on to Catherine. Something passed between husband and wife, a look of regret, of apology, of resigned determination. "Therefore," William said, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth, "I have asked you all here tonight not only to celebrate our harvest, but to witness an important announcement regarding the future of the royal family." The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Christopher felt as if the very air had thickened, making it difficult to breathe. Beside him, Catherine stood perfectly still, but he could feel the tremor running through her body. And then, cutting through the tension like a knife, came Cordelia's voice from across the room, clear, confident, and filled with barely contained triumph. "How wonderful," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The kingdom does so love a royal surprise." Christopher turned to look at his wife, and in her eyes he saw the gleeful anticipation of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. Whatever William was about to announce, Cordelia not only knew about it, she had helped orchestrate it. The realization hit Christopher with stunning force. This wasn't just about William making a difficult decision for the good of the kingdom. This was about Cordelia finally achieving something she had wanted since the day she became queen. And Catherine, his beloved daughter-in-law, was standing at the center of it all, about to become the sacrifice on the altar of royal politics. In that moment, as William opened his mouth to speak words that would change everything, Christopher made a decision of his own. He had been king long enough to know when to choose between duty and family, between political necessity and moral obligation. He would not let them destroy Catherine without a fight. The king straightened his shoulders, prepared to step forward and interrupt his son's announcement, when William's voice rang out across the ballroom, clear and irrevocable. "I have decided," the crown prince said, "that it is time for the kingdom of Valdres to embrace a new chapter in its history." And Christopher knew, with the certainty that comes from 27 years of reading the political winds, that everything was about to change forever. The morning after the Harvest Festival ball dawned gray and cold, matching the mood that had settled over Eldermore Palace like a heavy shroud. Christopher stood at the window of his private study, watching the palace gardeners tend to the rose bushes that had been his late wife Isabella's pride and joy. The roses were dormant now, preparing for winter's harsh embrace, their thorny stems bare of the blooms that had once filled these gardens with color and life. He hadn't slept. How could he, when his son's words from the night before kept echoing in his mind? William had stopped short of making his full announcement, claiming he wanted to speak with his family privately before sharing the details with the court. But Christopher had seen enough royal maneuvering in his lifetime to know that whatever William planned would tear their family apart. A soft knock at the door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, not turning from the window. "Your Majesty." It was Geoffrey, his private secretary, a thin man with graying hair who had served the royal family for over 20 years. "Prince William has requested an audience with you. He's waiting in the blue drawing room." Christopher nodded curtly. "Tell him I'll be there shortly." After Geoffrey left, Christopher remained at the window for several more minutes, gathering his thoughts and steeling himself for what was to come. The blue drawing room was one of the smaller reception chambers in the palace, decorated in shades of sapphire and gold with portraits of Valdrian kings stretching back 6 centuries. William stood near the fireplace, still wearing the same uniform from the night before, though it was now wrinkled and his hair disheveled. He looked like a man who hadn't slept either. "Father," William said, turning as Christopher entered the room. "Thank you for seeing me so early." Christopher closed the door behind him and studied his son's face. William had inherited Isabella's delicate features, but Christopher's gray eyes, and those eyes now held a weariness that seemed far beyond his 38 years. "You look terrible," Christopher said bluntly. "When was the last time you ate? Or slept?" William managed a weak smile. "Concern noted, father. But there are more pressing matters to discuss." Christopher moved to one of the blue velvet chairs, but didn't sit down. "Indeed there are. Starting with what you were planning to announce last night before you lost your nerve." The accusation hung in the air between them. William's jaw tightened, and for a moment Christopher saw a flash of the stubborn child he had once been, the boy who would argue passionately for causes he believed in even when facing certain punishment. "I didn't lose my nerve," William said quietly. "I realized that some conversations need to happen in private before they become public proclamations." "Conversations with whom?" "Your wife, who spent the evening looking like she was attending her own funeral. Your stepmother, who couldn't hide her satisfaction if her life depended on it. Or perhaps your father, who has somehow been left out of whatever conspiracy you've hatched." William flinched at the harsh words. "It's not a conspiracy, father. It's a necessity." "Explain it to me then." Christopher finally sat down, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Help me understand how my son, who has always valued honor and loyalty above all else, has apparently decided to abandon both in a single evening." For a long moment, William said nothing. He moved to the window, gazing out at the same gardens his father had been watching earlier. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "Do you remember what you told me on my 18th birthday? About the burden of the crown?" Christopher remembered. It had been a solemn ceremony, marking William's formal entry into adulthood and his official recognition as crown prince. Afterward, they had walked these same gardens while Christopher explained the realities of royal life. "I told you that being king means making choices that ordinary people never face. That sometimes the needs of the kingdom must come before personal desires. You told me that the crown demands everything," William continued, still looking out the window. "That it would ask me to sacrifice my comfort, my privacy, my freedom, and sometimes even my happiness. You said that if I wasn't prepared to give everything for Valdris, I should abdicate and let someone else wear the crown." Christopher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. "William, what have you done?" His son turned away from the window, and Christopher was shocked to see tears in his eyes. "I've done what I had to do, father. What you trained me to do. I've put the kingdom first. By destroying your marriage. By ending it." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief. "The marriage was a mistake, father. Not Catherine's fault, not mine, but a mistake nonetheless. One that has prevented both of us from fulfilling our true purposes." Christopher stared at his son as if seeing a stranger. "Your true purpose? William, you love Catherine. I've seen you with her, watched you light up when she enters a room. Are you telling me that was all an act?" "No, it wasn't an act. I do love her, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Which is exactly why this is so difficult." William began pacing the room, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that reminded Christopher painfully of his own nervous habits. "Love," William continued, "has made me weak. It has made me hesitate when decisive action was needed, compromise when firmness was required. A king cannot afford such luxuries." "What decisive action? What situation requires you to cast aside your wife like a worn-out cloak?" William stopped pacing and looked directly at his father. "The succession, father. The question of who will rule Valdris after you're gone, and after me." Christopher felt the world tilt slightly. "You have been my heir since birth. The succession is settled by law and tradition." "Is it?" William's voice took on the tone he used during council meetings, logical and detached. "I am 38 years old, father. Catherine is 35. We have been married for 15 years without producing an heir. The nobles grow restless. They whisper about the stability of the dynasty, about whether the crown will pass to some distant cousin when I die." The truth hit Christopher like a physical blow. This wasn't about love or duty in the abstract. This was about the most fundamental requirement of any royal marriage: the production of children to continue the line. Catherine cannot have children, Christopher said slowly, understanding flooding through him. That's what this is about. William nodded grimly. We've seen every physician in the kingdom, consulted with experts from neighboring realms. The conclusion is always the same. There will be no children from our marriage. Christopher sank back into his chair, feeling suddenly old. The irony was bitter. His own marriage to Isabella had been blessed with only one child after years of hoping for more. He understood the pressure, the constant speculation, the weight of knowing that the failure to produce an heir could destabilize an entire kingdom. So your solution is to set Catherine aside and marry someone else? Someone younger who might give you sons? It's not my solution, William said sharply. Do you think I haven't explored every other option? Adoption isn't recognized under Valdrian law for royal succession. Changing the law would require the consent of the noble council, and half of them are already circling like vultures, hoping for a chance to place their own daughters on the throne. Christopher thought of the ambitious families at court, the way certain lords had been pushing their unmarried daughters forward at every social gathering. Lord Pemberton's daughter Sophia, barely 19, and beautiful in the vapid way that often appealed to men seeking trophy wives. Lady Westmere's niece Caroline, who had been educated in the finest finishing schools and spoke 4 languages. A dozen others, all of noble blood, all of childbearing age, all representing political alliances that could strengthen the throne. And Cordelia supports this plan, I assume? William's expression grew even more troubled. Cordelia has been instrumental in exploring options. She has connections throughout the realm, understands the political necessities involved. I'm sure she does. Christopher's voice was dry as autumn leaves. And I suppose she's already selected your next bride? The choice hasn't been made yet, William said, but something in his tone suggested that wasn't entirely true. Christopher stood up abruptly and began his own restless pacing. Have you discussed any of this with Catherine? Does she know what you're planning? Not the details, but she suspects. Catherine is intelligent, father. She's noticed the whispered conversations, the sudden interest certain families have shown in court functions. She knows something is coming. And you're content to let her suffer in uncertainty while you and Cordelia arrange her replacement behind closed doors. William's composure finally cracked. Content. Do you think any part of this brings me contentment? Do you think I want to hurt the woman I love? Catherine is the best thing that ever happened to me, the light that has made these past 15 years bearable. Casting her aside will be like tearing out my own heart. Then, don't do it, Christopher said simply. Find another way. There is no other way. William's voice rose to nearly a shout before he caught himself, and continued more quietly. I've spent months exploring alternatives, father. Months lying awake at night, trying to find a solution that would preserve both my marriage and the kingdom's stability. There isn't one. Christopher stopped pacing and faced his son. Who else is involved in this decision? Besides you and Cordelia? William hesitated. Lord Chancellor Hamilton has provided legal counsel. Minister Bradford has outlined the diplomatic implications. Lady Cordelia has served as an intermediary with several noble families. You've built an entire conspiracy around my daughter-in-law without consulting the one person who should have the final say, your king and father. I was planning to inform you after the arrangements were finalized, William said defensively. I didn't want to burden you with the details until everything was settled. Christopher felt anger rising in his chest, hot and clean after the confusion and dread of the morning. Burden me? I am still the king, William. This is still my kingdom. You don't make decisions about the royal succession without my knowledge and consent. Technically, the dissolution of my marriage is within my authority as Crown Prince under the Royal Marriage Act of 1847, William said, slipping into the formal language of law. Don't quote statutes at me, boy. Christopher's voice carried the full weight of royal authority, the tone that had silenced rooms full of argumentative nobles. I wrote half of those laws. And the decision to set aside a crown princess requires the consent of the reigning monarch. Did you forget that detail in your research? William paled slightly. Father, surely you can see the necessity. What I see, Christopher interrupted, is my son preparing to destroy his life, and the life of an innocent woman because he's too frightened to fight for what he really wants. You speak of duty and sacrifice, but this isn't noble duty, William. This is cowardice. The words hit their target. William recoiled as if he'd been slapped. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell you the truth? Point out that you're allowing fear to drive you into making the worst mistake of your life. Christopher moved closer to his son, his voice intense, but not unkind. I know something about royal marriages, William. I loved your mother beyond reason, just as you love Catherine. And, yes, there were pressures, expectations, political considerations that made our life difficult. But we faced them together. Mother gave you an heir, William said quietly. She fulfilled her duty. After 8 years of marriage and 3 miscarriages that nearly killed her, the words hung in the air like a confession. Christopher had never spoken openly about the early struggles of his marriage, the heartbreak and hope that had marked those years. The court was every bit as restless then, every bit as ready to suggest alternatives. Do you know what I told them? William shook his head. I told them that I would rather see the crown pass to my brother's line than betray the woman I loved. That the kingdom would survive regardless of who wore the crown. But I would not survive destroying my own soul for political convenience. William stared at his father as if seeing him for the first time. You never told me any of this. Because I hoped you would never face the same choice. I hoped you would be blessed with children easily, that the question would never arise. Christopher's voice grew sad. But life rarely grants us our hopes, does it? A soft knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Both men turned as Geoffrey entered the room, his face carefully neutral. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption. Princess Catherine has requested an audience with Prince William. She's waiting in her private sitting room. William and Christopher exchanged glances. The moment of reckoning had arrived, whether they were ready for it or not. Tell her I'll be there shortly, William said. After Geoffrey left, father and son stood in silence for several moments. Finally, Christopher spoke. What will you tell her? William straightened his shoulders, and Christopher saw the weight of kingship settling on him like a mantle. The truth, that sometimes love isn't enough, no matter how much we might wish it were. And if she fights you? If she refuses to accept your decision quietly? For the first time that morning, William smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. Then, she'll remind me why I fell in love with her in the first place. Catherine has never backed down from a challenge in her life. Christopher watched his son walk toward the door, then called after him. William. The Crown Prince paused, his hand on the door handle. Before you say words that cannot be taken back, remember this. Kingdoms rise and fall, dynasties come and go, but the choices we make and how we treat the people we love echo through eternity. Make sure you can live with those echoes. William nodded once, then left the room, leaving Christopher alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that before this day was over, their family would be irrevocably changed. Outside the window, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Christopher couldn't shake the feeling that they were a portent of the tempest about to break over the royal house of Valdres. Catherine's private sitting room had always been her sanctuary within the vast labyrinth of Eldermore Palace. She had decorated it herself 15 years ago as a young bride, choosing soft yellow wallpaper painted with climbing roses, comfortable furniture that invited conversation rather than formal protocol, and windows that looked out over the palace's private gardens. It was here that she came to read, to write letters to charitable organizations, to escape the suffocating formality that governed the rest of her life. Today, however, the cheerful room felt like a trap. Catherine sat rigidly in her favorite armchair, still wearing the elaborate gown from the night before. She hadn't been able to bring herself to change clothes, as if maintaining the appearance of normalcy might somehow hold her life together just a little longer. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, hovered nearby like a worried mother hen. Your Highness, perhaps you should rest. You haven't slept. I'm fine, Margaret, Catherine said without taking her eyes off the window. A light rain had begun to fall, turning the world outside gray and bleak. Has Prince William responded to my message? His secretary said he would come directly after his meeting with His Majesty, Margaret replied carefully. The entire palace staff had sensed the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm, though none dared speak of it openly. Catherine nodded absently. She had spent the sleepless night replaying every moment of the past few weeks, looking for clues she might have missed. The signs had been there, she realized now. William's distraction, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room, Cordelia's barely concealed satisfaction. Most telling of all had been William's growing distance, the way he kissed her forehead instead of her lips, the careful space he maintained between them even when they were alone. A sharp rap at the door made both women look up. Enter, Catherine called, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. William stepped into the room, and Catherine's breath caught in her throat. He looked haggard, older than his years, with dark circles under his eyes and the kind of bone-deep weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. But he was still her William, still the man who had courted her with such gentle persistence, who had promised to love and protect her until death parted them. "Margaret, please leave us," Catherine said quietly. Her lady-in-waiting curtsied and withdrew, closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. William remained standing near the door, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture he adopted during difficult state meetings. The distance between them felt vast, though it was only a few feet of carpet decorated with yellow roses. "Catherine," he began, then stopped, as if uncertain how to continue. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair across from hers. "You look as if you're about to collapse." He moved to the chair but perched on the edge rather than settling back, ready to flee at a moment's notice. Catherine studied his face, noting the tension in his jaw, the way he avoided meeting her eyes directly. "You wanted to speak with me," William said formally. Catherine almost smiled at the absurdity of it. After 15 years of marriage, they had been reduced to making appointments to speak with each other. "I think we're past the point of polite formalities, don't you?" William's composure cracked slightly. "Catherine, you're going to set me aside." The words came out calmly, matter-of-factly, though they felt like knives cutting through her throat. "That's what you were building up to last night, isn't it? That's why you've been having secret meetings, and why Cordelia looks like the cat who caught the canary." William went very still, his gray eyes finally meeting hers directly. "How long have you known?" "Known for certain?" "Since last night, when I saw your father's face during your speech. But I've suspected for weeks." Catherine rose from her chair and moved to the window, needing to put distance between them before she said what came next. "The question is why, William? What have I done to deserve this?" "You've done nothing wrong," William said quickly, rising to follow her. "Catherine, you have been everything a man could ask for in a wife. Kind, intelligent, devoted to your duties, beloved by the people. This isn't about your failings." "Then what?" She turned to face him, and he was struck by how beautiful she looked even in her pain, even with exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "If I've been such a perfect wife, why are you so eager to replace me?" William felt the words stick in his throat like thorns. How could he explain the political pressures, the whispered concerns about the succession, the growing boldness of noble families pushing their daughters forward as potential alternatives? How could he make her understand that his love for her was precisely what made this decision so agonizing? "The kingdom needs an heir," he said finally, the words emerging like a confession. "We've been married 15 years, Catherine. The physicians have made it clear that children are unlikely." Catherine turned back to the window, her reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. "Unlikely. Such a clinical word for the death of all our dreams. The nobles are growing restless. There are whispers about the stability of the dynasty, suggestions that perhaps the crown should pass to someone more capable of ensuring the succession." "More fertile, you mean?" Catherine's voice was bitter. "How convenient for them that my biological failings provide such a tidy excuse for their ambitions." William moved closer, close enough to see the tears she was fighting to hold back. "It's not about their ambitions, Catherine. It's about the survival of the kingdom. A monarchy without heirs is a monarchy in crisis. The peace and stability we've built over the past decades could crumble if the succession remains in doubt." "And have you already selected my replacement?" Catherine asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Is she young and pretty and proven fertile? Does Cordelia approve of your choice?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. William's silence was answer enough. Catherine laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Of course she does. I imagine she's been instrumental in the selection process. After all, who better to choose the next Queen of Valdres than the woman who spent 7 years being reminded that she's only the second choice herself?" "Cordelia has been helpful in exploring options," William admitted reluctantly. "She understands the political considerations. Catherine whirled to face him, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "Is that what I am now? A political consideration to be weighed and found wanting?" "No." William reached for her, but she stepped back, maintaining the distance between them. "Catherine, you are the woman I love. You are my heart, my conscience, my greatest joy. Nothing will ever change that. Nothing except your desire for a son. It's not desire, it's necessity." William's own control began to fray. "Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I want to lose you, to spend the rest of my life married to some stranger while knowing that my happiness died the day I signed the dissolution papers?" Then, don't do it, Catherine said simply. Choose love over duty for once in your life. Choose us. William stared at her as if she had suggested he abdicate the throne and become a farmer. I can't. The kingdom will survive, Catherine interrupted. Kingdoms always do. They adapt, they change, they find new ways to ensure continuity. But, William, if you do this, if you cast aside our marriage for political expedience, you will never recover from it. It will hollow you out, leave you nothing but an empty crown sitting on a broken man's head. Her words echoed his father's warning from that morning, and William felt something twist painfully in his chest. You don't understand the pressures I face, don't I? Catherine's eyes flashed with anger. I've lived with those pressures for 15 years, William. Every time a noble's wife announced her pregnancy, every time someone made a pointed comment about the future of the dynasty, every time the physicians looked at me with pity and spoke in whispers about my failings. Do you think I haven't felt the weight of every expectation, every hope, every disappointment? William was quiet, struck by the pain in her voice. The difference between us, Catherine continued, is that I learned to carry that burden without letting it define me. I found other ways to serve the kingdom, other ways to matter. The children's hospitals I've founded, the educational programs for young women, the charitable works that bear the royal seal. I may not have given Valdres an heir, but I've given it 15 years of devoted service. No one questions your service, don't they? Catherine's laugh was sharp. Lord Pemberton's wife made a point of mentioning her daughter's robust health and proven bloodline at last month's garden party. Lady Westmere has been parading her niece around court functions like a prize heifer. Even the servants whisper about my unfortunate condition when they think I can't hear them. William felt shame wash over him. He had been so focused on the political implications of their childless marriage that he had failed to consider what Catherine endured daily, the subtle slights, the pitying looks, the constant reminder that she was somehow deficient in her most fundamental duty as a royal wife. Catherine, I'm sorry. I should have protected you better from their cruelties. You can protect me now, she said urgently, moving closer to him. Stand with me, William. Tell the nobles that love matters more than bloodlines, that the strength of a monarchy lies in the character of its rulers, not just their ability to produce children. For a moment, William wavered. Standing this close to her, seeing the hope and love in her eyes despite everything, he could almost believe it was possible. Almost imagine a future where they faced the challenges together, where their love proved stronger than political necessity. But then, reality crashed back down on him. The whispered conversations in the noble council, the barely concealed ambition in certain lords' eyes, the fragile stability that could shatter if the succession question remained unresolved. He thought of his father's words about the crown demanding everything, about the terrible choices that came with royal blood. I can't, he whispered, the words torn from his soul. Catherine, I'm sorry, but I can't. The risk to the kingdom is too great. Catherine stepped back as if he had struck her. The hope in her eyes died, replaced by something cold and hard that he had never seen there before. Then, you're not the man I thought I married, she said quietly. The William I fell in love with would have fought for us. He would have found another way, no matter how difficult. But that man seems to have died somewhere along the way, suffocated by duty and fear. Catherine, no. She held up a hand to stop him. You've made your choice, William. You've chosen to let other people's ambitions and fears dictate your life. But I won't make it easy for you. William felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? Catherine moved to the writing desk in the corner of the room and pulled out a sheet of cream-colored paper bearing the royal seal. You want to dissolve our marriage? Then you'll have to face the consequences. I won't simply disappear quietly into some remote estate while you marry your fertile young bride and pretend our 15 years together never happened. What are you planning to do? I'm going to fight, Catherine said, her voice steady and determined. I'm going to use every legal option available to me, every political alliance I've built, every friend I've made over the past 15 years. You want to cast me aside? Then you'll have to do it publicly, with all the kingdom watching. You'll have to explain to the people why their beloved princess is being discarded like yesterday's news. William felt panic rising in his throat. A public battle would be a disaster, would tear the royal family apart, and potentially destabilize the entire kingdom. Catherine, please be reasonable. Reasonable? Her voice rose to near shouting before she caught herself, and continued more quietly. You're asking me to be reasonable about the destruction of my life, my identity, my purpose? You're asking me to smile and Not while you replace me with some young girl who can give you sons. The dissolution would be handled discreetly. You would retain your title, your income, your position in society. My position in society. Catherine's eyes blazed. As what? The discarded first wife? The barren woman who wasn't good enough to remain queen? You think money and titles can compensate for the humiliation of being publicly rejected for my biological failings? William realized he was seeing a side of Catherine he had never witnessed before. Not the dutiful princess or the loving wife, but the strong woman who lay beneath those roles. The woman who had survived 15 years of court intrigue, who had built her own network of allies and supporters, who commanded respect and affection throughout the kingdom. What do you want from me? He asked desperately. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but implacable. I want you to remember what you're throwing away. I want you to look at your young bride on your wedding day and remember the woman who loved you when you were just a prince, before you became so consumed with being a king that you forgot how to be a man. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. And William? When the loneliness sets in, and it will, when you realize that duty is a cold bedfellow and political necessity a poor substitute for love, don't come looking for forgiveness. Because I won't have any left to give. She opened the door and left without another word, leaving William alone in the cheerful yellow room that would forever remind him of everything he was about to lose. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, and the gentle rain became a deluge, as if the very heavens were weeping for what was about to be destroyed. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in Catherine's sitting room, and Eldermore Palace had become a battlefield disguised as a royal residence. The servants moved through the corridors with the careful neutrality of people trying to avoid choosing sides in a war they didn't understand, while the noble families who frequented the court watched the unfolding drama with the fascination of spectators at a gladiatorial contest. Christopher stood in the map room, staring at the ancient charts that covered the walls. These maps had guided the kingdom of Valdris through centuries of conflicts, marking territories won and lost, alliances forged and broken. Today, he felt as if he needed such guidance to navigate the treacherous waters his own family had become. A sharp rap at the door announced the arrival of Lord Chancellor Hamilton, a tall, austere man whose loyalty to the crown was matched only by his devotion to legal precedent. He entered carrying an armful of leather-bound volumes and rolled parchments, his face bearing the expression of someone tasked with solving an impossible puzzle. Your Majesty, Hamilton said, bowing formally before setting his burden down on the massive oak table that dominated the center of the room. You asked me to research the legal implications of Prince William's proposed actions. Christopher turned from the maps, his face grim. And what have you discovered, Hamilton? Can my son destroy his marriage as easily as he seems to believe? The Lord Chancellor opened one of the volumes and consulted his notes. The situation is complex, Your Majesty. Under the Royal Marriage Act of 1847, a crown prince does have the authority to dissolve his marriage under certain circumstances. However, the process requires formal approval from the reigning monarch, which I have not given and do not intend to give, Christopher said firmly. Indeed, Your Majesty. But there are complications. Hamilton's voice took on the careful tone of a man delivering unwelcome news. Princess Catherine has invoked her right to a formal hearing before the noble council. This means the matter cannot be resolved privately. The entire question will be debated publicly, with both parties presenting their cases before the assembled lords and ladies of the realm. Christopher felt his heart sink. A public hearing would be a spectacle, turning their family's private pain into entertainment for the nobility. Worse, it would expose the kingdom's internal divisions to neighboring realms who might see weakness and opportunity. How did Catherine manage to invoke such proceedings so quickly? It appears, Your Majesty, that Princess Catherine has been unusually well prepared. She has retained the services of Lord Justice Blackwood, who previously served as chief advocate to the royal court. She has also gathered supporting testimony from several prominent nobles and has requested permission to call character witnesses. Christopher raised an eyebrow. Character witnesses? The heads of the various charitable organizations she has supported, physicians who can testify to her medical condition, even representatives from foreign courts who have interacted with her during state visits. Princess Catherine appears to be building a case that the proposed dissolution is not only legally questionable, but morally unjustifiable. Before Christopher could respond, another knock interrupted them. This time it was Cordelia who entered, dressed in an elegant burgundy morning gown that emphasized her still striking appearance. She moved with the confidence of a woman who believed victory was within her grasp. "Christopher, darling," she said, barely acknowledging Hamilton's presence. "I hope I'm not interrupting important business." "Everything is important business these days," Christopher replied coolly. "What can I do for you, Cordelia?" She smiled, but Christopher caught the sharp calculation behind her green eyes. "I wanted to discuss the arrangements for Prince William's future. The political considerations that need to be addressed once this unfortunate situation with Catherine is resolved." "Unfortunate situation?" Christopher's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You speak of my daughter-in-law as if she were a minor inconvenience." Cordelia's smile never wavered. "Of course I don't mean to diminish Catherine's contributions to the royal family. But surely you can see that personal feelings must sometimes give way to practical necessities. The kingdom needs an heir, Christopher. The nobility grows restless when the succession remains uncertain." Hamilton cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I may, Your Majesty, there is also the matter of the formal betrothal contracts that have been preliminarily discussed." Christopher felt ice form in his veins. "Betrothal contracts? Nothing has been finalized," Cordelia said quickly. "But, given the urgency of the situation, it seemed prudent to explore potential alliances. The Marquis of Ashford has a daughter, Lady Sophia, who is 19 and of impeccable reputation. The Duke of Northumberland has also expressed interest in a possible match with his niece, Lady Caroline. You've been negotiating my son's future marriage before his current wife has even been set aside." Christopher's voice was deadly quiet. Cordelia's composure faltered slightly. "Christopher, you must understand the political realities. I understand perfectly." Christopher moved closer to his wife, his presence radiating the authority of a man who had ruled for nearly 3 decades. "I understand that you have overstepped your bounds so dramatically that you've forgotten who actually wears the crown in this kingdom." "Your Majesty," Hamilton interjected carefully, "there is another matter that requires your attention. Princess Catherine's legal team has requested access to certain historical documents relating to royal marriages and succession laws. Specifically, they want to review the precedents set during the reign of King Edward IV. Christopher knew exactly what Catherine was looking for. King Edward IV had faced a similar crisis when his first wife proved unable to provide an heir. Rather than divorce her, he had changed the succession laws to allow adoption of noble children into the royal line. It had been controversial at the time, but had ultimately preserved both his marriage and the stability of the throne. "Grant them access to whatever they need," Christopher said. "The royal archives are available to both parties in this matter." Cordelia's eyes flashed with alarm. "Christopher, surely that's not wise. Those precedents are ancient, hardly applicable to modern circumstances." "Let the lawyers argue about applicability," Christopher replied. "I won't have it said that the crown prevented either party from mounting a proper defense." Hamilton nodded and made a note in his ledger. "Very good, Your Majesty. There is one more issue. The hearing before the Noble Council has been scheduled for next week at the request of Prince William's representatives. However, Princess Catherine's team has filed for a delay, claiming they need more time to prepare their case." "How long a delay?" 6 months, Your Majesty." Christopher almost smiled despite the gravity of the situation. Catherine was playing a masterful game, using every legal maneuver available to draw out the proceedings. 6 months would give her time to rally support, to turn public opinion in her favor, and to make William's life as uncomfortable as possible. And Prince William's response to this delay? "His Highness has objected strenuously. He wishes to resolve the matter quickly and quietly." "I'm sure he does," Christopher murmured. "Very well, Hamilton. Review Princess Catherine's request and advise me on the legal merits. I want to ensure that whatever decision I make is based on law rather than sentiment." After Hamilton departed, Christopher found himself alone with Cordelia, who had been unusually quiet during the latter part of the conversation. She stood near the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass, and when she turned to face him, her expression was troubled. "Christopher, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice lacking its usual confident edge. "Whatever you may think of my methods, my motivations are not entirely selfish." Christopher raised an eyebrow. "Indeed, the kingdom truly does need an heir. I've seen what happens when succession questions are left unresolved. My own father's realm nearly tore itself apart in civil war when my uncle challenged his right to the throne. The stability we take for granted here in Valdres is more fragile than you might think. And you believe that justifies destroying 2 people's lives." Cordelia was quiet for a moment, and, when she spoke again, her voice was softer than Christopher had heard it in years. I believe that sometimes the needs of many must outweigh the desires of few, even when those few are people we care about. Do you care about William, Cordelia? Or do you simply see him as a means to secure your own position? The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Cordelia's face cycled through several emotions before settling on something that might have been regret. I care about all of you more than you know, she said finally. But I also remember what it feels like to live in the shadow of a ghost. Isabella has been dead for 9 years, Christopher, but she still haunts these halls. Every portrait, every garden she planted, every tradition she established reminds everyone that I am the replacement queen, the political necessity who could never measure up to the beloved original. Christopher was startled by the raw honesty in her words. He had never considered how difficult Cordelia's position might be, how it would feel to constantly be compared to a woman who had achieved near sainthood in death. If William casts aside Catherine and marries again, Cordelia continued, the new queen will face the same challenges I have. She will always be measured against the woman who came before, always found wanting in comparison. At least this way, the transition serves a clear purpose. At least the kingdom gains an heir from the sacrifice. And what about the cost to William? To Catherine? To the institution of marriage itself? Cordelia moved closer to him, and, for the first time in years, Christopher saw genuine vulnerability in her eyes. The cost will be enormous. I know that. But, Christopher, if the dynasty fails, if Valdres falls into chaos because we were too sentimental to make hard choices, won't the cost be even greater? Before Christopher could answer, the door burst open without ceremony. William strode into the room, his hair disheveled, and his clothes rumpled as if he had been riding hard. His face bore the wild look of a man pushed beyond his limits. Father, he said breathlessly, we have a problem. Christopher felt his stomach drop. What kind of problem? Catherine has left the palace. This morning, while we were all focused on legal proceedings and political arrangements, she simply packed a bag and rode away. Her lady-in-waiting found a note saying she had gone to seek counsel from someone who might actually care about her welfare. Cordelia paled. Where did she go? William's voice was grim when he answered. To the convent of St. Bridget. She's claiming sanctuary with Mother Superior Agatha. Christopher closed his eyes as the full implications hit him. The convent of St. Bridget was not just any religious house. It was the most prominent abbey in the kingdom, whose Mother Superior was known throughout Valdres for her fierce independence and her willingness to challenge royal authority when she believed it conflicted with moral law. Mother Superior Agatha, Christopher said slowly, who has never hesitated to speak out against injustice, regardless of who might be committing it. The same, William confirmed. And, Father, there's more. Catherine sent word that she intends to take religious vows if the dissolution proceeds. She claims that if she cannot serve the kingdom as queen, she will serve God as a nun. The scandal will be enormous. Cordelia sank into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her. The political ramifications were staggering. A crown princess entering a convent in protest of her husband's actions would be seen throughout Christendom as either a saint driven to religious life by persecution or a madwoman driven to extremes by grief. Either interpretation would cast William and the royal family in a disastrous light. Can she actually do this? Christopher asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Once she takes preliminary vows, it becomes much more complicated to force her return to secular life, William said heavily. And Mother Superior Agatha has already sent word that the convent will respect Princess Catherine's decision and provide her with sanctuary for as long as she desires. Christopher looked at his son and saw not the confident crown prince, but a young man who had finally realized that his carefully laid plans were crumbling around him. William had wanted a quiet, dignified dissolution that would allow him to remarry without scandal. Instead, he was facing a public relations disaster that would make him appear as a heartless tyrant who had driven his beloved wife into religious exile. What do you want to do? Christopher asked quietly. William was silent for a long moment, staring out the window toward the distant spires of the convent where his wife had sought refuge. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow with defeat. I don't know, Father. For the first time in my life, I truly don't know what to do. Outside, storm clouds continued to gather on the horizon, and Christopher couldn't help but think that the tempest was just beginning. The convent of St. Bridget stood on a windswept hill overlooking the capital city of Valdres, its ancient stone walls weathered by centuries of storms but still standing strong against the elements. Founded 300 years ago by a princess who had chosen God over an arranged marriage, it had become a place of refuge for women seeking escape from the constraints of worldly life. Christopher rode through the gates of the convent just as dawn was breaking over the kingdom, his small entourage having traveled through the night. He had left William at the palace, pacing his study like a caged wolf, while Cordelia remained conspicuously absent from all discussions about retrieving Catherine. The Queen's initial confidence had evaporated once she realized that her carefully orchestrated plan was spiraling completely out of control. Mother Superior Agatha met him at the entrance to the main building, a woman of perhaps 60 years whose steel-gray hair and penetrating blue eyes spoke of a lifetime spent standing up to powerful men who underestimated her resolve. She curtsied respectfully but without the slightest hint of subservience. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. "I trust your journey was not too arduous." "Mother Superior," Christopher replied, dismounting from his horse and handing the reins to one of his guards. "Thank you for receiving me on such short notice. Any member of the royal family is always welcome at St. Bridget's," Agatha said diplomatically, "though I confess I was somewhat surprised by your request for a private audience. It has been many years since a reigning monarch has visited our humble abbey." Christopher followed her into the building, noting the simple elegance of the interior. Plain stone walls were adorned with beautiful tapestries depicting scenes from religious history, while tall windows filled the spaces with natural light that eliminated any sense of confinement or gloom. This was not a prison for unwilling women, but a sanctuary for those who chose it freely. "I assume you know why I'm here," Christopher said as they walked through corridors filled with the soft sound of prayer and quiet industry. "Princess Catherine arrived 3 days ago seeking sanctuary," Agatha confirmed. "She has been given quarters in our guest house and has asked for time to consider her future. We have, of course, honored her request." They entered a small but comfortable receiving room furnished with simple wooden chairs and a table bearing a vase of autumn flowers. Through the window, Christopher could see the convent's gardens where several nuns tended to late-season vegetables with the patient devotion of those who understood that all honest work was prayer. "Has she spoken to you about her intentions?" Christopher asked once they were seated. Agatha's expression remained carefully neutral. "Princess Catherine has shared some of her concerns about her current circumstances. She has also asked many questions about our way of life here at St. Bridget's. But, Your Majesty, I must emphasize that any woman who seeks sanctuary here does so under the protection of church law. I cannot compel Princess Catherine to leave against her will, nor can I reveal the details of our private conversations." Christopher had expected as much. Mother Superior Agatha was known throughout the kingdom for her unwavering defense of church authority against secular interference. She had once refused entry to a duke who wanted to forcibly retrieve his daughter from the convent, standing in the gateway herself until he backed down rather than risk the scandal of physically confronting a woman of God. "I'm not here to compel anything," Christopher said carefully. "I'm here as a father-in-law concerned about a woman I've come to regard as my own daughter. I'm here to understand what drove her to such a desperate choice." For the first time, Agatha's formal expression softened slightly. "Catherine is in great pain, Your Majesty. Not just from her current circumstances, but from 15 years of bearing a burden that was never hers to carry alone. She has been made to feel like a failure for something completely beyond her control. The question of children," Christopher said quietly. Among other things, Agatha rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where her nuns worked in peaceful harmony. "She speaks of feeling like a political pawn, valuable only for what she might produce rather than who she is as a person. She describes a court where her worth is measured solely by her fertility, where noble families circle like vultures waiting for her to be discarded so they can advance their own daughters." Christopher felt shame wash over him as he recognized the truth in Agatha's words. The court of Valdres, for all its elegance and culture, was still fundamentally a place where women were valued primarily for their ability to secure political alliances and produce heirs. Catherine had navigated that world with grace and dignity, but the cost had clearly been enormous. "What does she want?" he asked. "Peace," Agatha said simply. "An end to the constant scrutiny, the whispered conversations, the feeling that she is always one royal decree away from losing everything she has built over the past 15 years. She wants to be valued for her mind, her compassion, her service, rather than judged by her biological limitations. And she believes the convent can provide that? Agatha turned back to face him, her expression thoughtful. The religious life offers many things, Your Majesty. Purpose, community, the chance to serve God directly rather than through secular institutions. For some women, it represents freedom rather than confinement. But I have counseled Catherine to consider carefully whether she is called to this life by faith or driven to it by desperation. The two are not the same thing. Before Christopher could respond, a soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A young novice entered and curtsied deeply. "Mother Superior," she said quietly. "Princess Catherine asks if she might join your conversation with His Majesty. She says there are things that need to be said." Agatha looked at Christopher, who nodded his consent. A few minutes later, Catherine entered the room, and Christopher was struck by the change in her appearance. Gone were the elaborate gowns and complex hairstyles of court life. Instead, she wore a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes, and her golden hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She looked younger somehow, less burdened, as if the weight of royal expectation had been lifted from her shoulders. "Your Majesty," she said, curtsying to her father-in-law with the same respect she had always shown him. "Catherine," Christopher replied, rising to embrace her gently. "My dear child, we have all been worried about you." "I needed time to think," Catherine said as they settled into chairs around the small table. "Time away from the palace, away from the whispers and schemes and political calculations. Time to remember who I am beneath all the titles and expectations." Christopher studied her face, noting that while she looked tired, there was also a calmness about her that he hadn't seen in months. "And what have you discovered about yourself?" Catherine smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since the night of the Harvest Festival ball. "I've discovered that I'm stronger than I thought, that I don't need a crown to define my worth or a title to justify my existence. I've also discovered that running away, while temporarily satisfying, doesn't actually solve anything." "You're thinking of returning to the palace?" "I'm thinking of many things," Catherine said diplomatically. "But before I make any decisions, I need to understand what's really happening. Not the political maneuvering or the legal technicalities, but the truth about what William actually wants." Christopher exchanged glances with Mother Superior Agatha, who rose discreetly and moved toward the door. "I'll leave you two to speak privately," she said. "Catherine, you know where to find me if you need anything." After the door closed, Christopher leaned forward in his chair. "What do you want to know? Does William really believe that divorcing me is the only solution to the succession question? Or has he simply been convinced by others that this is the easiest path forward?" The question struck at the heart of everything that had been troubling Christopher about his son's decision. "I think," he said slowly, "that William has allowed fear to cloud his judgment. Fear of civil war, fear of political instability, fear of failing as a king. But underneath all that fear is a man who loves his wife and is terrified of losing her. Then, why is he so determined to cast me aside?" Christopher was quiet for a moment, searching for the right words. "Because he's been told repeatedly that a king cannot afford to put personal happiness above royal duty. Because he's been surrounded by advisors who see the succession crisis as a problem to be solved rather than a challenge to be overcome together. And because, God help us all, he's been influenced by a woman who sees your removal as the key to securing her own position." Catherine's expression darkened. "Cordelia. She has convinced William that the only path forward is through a new marriage to a young woman who can provide heirs quickly and decisively. She has already begun preliminary negotiations with several noble families." "While I was still living in the palace as William's wife?" Catherine said bitterly. "I'm afraid so." Christopher reached across the table and took her hands in his. "Catherine, I want you to know that I have not approved any of these arrangements. As long as I am king, no dissolution will take place without my explicit consent." Catherine looked up at him with surprise. "You would defy your own son to protect me?" "I would defy anyone to protect what is right and just," Christopher said firmly. "You have been a devoted wife, a caring daughter-in-law, and a valuable asset to this kingdom. You deserve better than to be discarded like yesterday's news because of circumstances beyond your control." Tears gathered in Catherine's eyes, the first tears Christopher had seen her shed throughout this entire ordeal. "I've tried so hard to be what everyone needed me to be. The perfect princess, the devoted wife, the charitable patron. But it was never enough, was it? In the end, the only thing that mattered was the one thing I couldn't provide." "That's not true," Christopher said gently. "You have provided far more to this kingdom than you realize." The children's hospitals you've founded, the educational programs you've championed, the diplomatic relationships you've built with neighboring realms. Your value cannot be measured solely by your ability to bear children. Try telling that to the noble council, Catherine said with a bitter laugh. Or to the ambitious families pushing their daughters forward as potential replacements. Or to William, who sees me now as an obstacle to his duty rather than a partner in fulfilling it. Christopher was quiet for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. What if I told you there was another way? A path that would preserve both your marriage and the succession? Catherine looked at him sharply. What do you mean? The laws of succession in Valdres have been changed before. During the reign of King Edward IV, adoption into the royal line was legally recognized as a legitimate path to inheritance. The precedent exists, Catherine. We could adopt an heir, someone from the noble families who already has royal blood through distant connections. Catherine stared at him as if he had just offered her the moon. Would William agree to such a thing? Would the noble council accept it? William is desperate enough that he might consider it, especially if the alternative is a public battle that tears the kingdom apart. As for the noble council, they would have to weigh their desire for biological heirs against their fear of political instability. A legally adopted heir might be preferable to a civil war over succession. Catherine rose and moved to the window, looking out over the kingdom that had been her home for 15 years. In the distance, the spires of Eldermore Palace were visible, glinting in the morning sunlight like a promise of possibilities yet to be explored. There would be conditions, she said slowly. The child would need to be young enough to be properly trained for kingship, old enough to understand the responsibilities involved. The adoption would need to be legally unassailable, accepted by all parties before any announcements were made. All of that could be arranged, Christopher said. The question is whether you would be willing to return and fight for this solution instead of accepting defeat. Catherine turned back to face him, and Christopher saw in her expression the same determination that had carried her through 15 years of court life. If William truly wants to save our marriage and serve the kingdom, then, yes, I'll fight. But I won't be a passive participant in my own rescue. I want to be involved in selecting the heir, in designing the adoption process, in ensuring that this solution serves the kingdom rather than just preserving my position as queen. Christopher smiled, recognizing the intelligent, strong-willed woman his son had fallen in love with all those years ago. I wouldn't have it any other way. As they prepared to leave the convent, Mother Superior Agatha appeared to see them off. She clasped Catherine's hands warmly and spoke in a voice only the princess could hear. Remember, my child, that true strength lies not in accepting what others decide for you, but in taking control of your own destiny. Whatever path you choose, walk it with your head held high. Catherine nodded, then turned to follow Christopher out of the sanctuary that had given her the peace and perspective she needed to face whatever came next. The ride back to Eldermore Palace was quiet, but it was the companionable silence of allies preparing for battle rather than the defeated quiet of those accepting surrender. As the familiar towers came into view, Catherine straightened her shoulders and prepared to reclaim her place in a kingdom that she refused to let discard her without a fight. Behind them, the